Starving and trembling, she had nothing, until he gave her his last chance. The snow was coming down hard on Christmas Eve, 1872, when Thomas Hale sat alone at his table with one bowl of soup and half a loaf of bread that had gone stiff at the edges. He had been ranching outside of Caldwell, Kansas for 11 years, and in all those years he had never once felt the silence of the house the way he felt it that night, pressed against him from every wall. It sat in the empty chair across from him. It followed him when he moved from the table to the window and back again. He was not a man who talked much. His neighbors in town knew him as the quiet one, the one who paid what he owed and never asked for more than what he earned. He had a face that looked like it had been left out in weather for a long time, lined and browned, with eyes that stayed steady even when things around him were not. He was 43 years old and he lived alone. He had not always lived alone. There had been a woman, Margaret, who came out from Ohio with him when they were both young and sure the land would give them everything they needed if they just worked it hard enough. She had brown hair and a laugh that made people in a room turn their heads. She gave him 2 sons, both of whom died before they were old enough to remember much of anything. Fever took the first one. A river took the second. Margaret herself left one morning not long after, not because she stopped loving Thomas, but because the land had taken too much from her and she had nothing left to give it back. She went home to Ohio and Thomas did not stop her. He understood. He just kept ranching. That was 9 years ago. He stood at the window now looking out at the snow and thinking about nothing in particular, which was how he usually spent his evenings, when he heard something outside the door. It was not a knock. It was softer than that. More like something brushing against the wood or falling against it, the way a branch sometimes came loose from a tree and hit the side of the house in the wind. He waited to hear it again. When he did, it was the same sound, soft and low, but this time with something else underneath it, something thin and high, like the sound a small animal makes when it is hurt and does not have the strength left to make much noise. Thomas set down his spoon and crossed the room in 4 steps. He opened the door. She was on his porch. She could not have been more than 6 years old, maybe 7, though she was so small and thin it was hard to say with any certainty. She was wearing a dress that had been a pale blue at some point but was now gray and wet through from the snow. She had no coat. She had no shoes. Her feet were bare on the wood of the porch and they were the color of old ash. She was sitting with her back against the door frame and her knees pulled up to her chest and her arms wrapped around herself. And she was shaking so hard that Thomas could see it even in the dim light spilling out from inside the house. She looked up at him when the door opened. Her eyes were very dark and very wide and there was snow caught in her hair. She did not say anything. She just looked at him. Thomas stood there for 1 moment, maybe 2, taking in what he was seeing. Then he bent down and picked her up and carried her inside and shut the door behind him with his boot. She weighed almost nothing. That was the first thing he noticed. How light she was. How he could feel the sharp edges of her shoulder blades when he held her. How her arms, when she let them fall from around herself, were thin as dry sticks. The second thing he noticed was how cold she was. Not just the cold of a person who has been outside too long, but a deeper cold, the kind that settles into a person when they have been without warmth for a very long time. He carried her to the chair nearest the stove and set her down in it. He pulled a blanket from the back of the other chair and wrapped it around her. Then he crouched in front of her and looked at her face. She was still shaking. Her lips had some blue in them. There was a cut above her left eyebrow that had dried to a dark line, and her cheeks were hollow in a way that no child's cheeks should be hollow. "You're all right," Thomas said. "You're inside now. You're going to warm up." She looked at him. She still did not speak. He went to the stove and put more wood in and got the fire up higher. He went to the table and brought her the bowl of soup. He pulled the other chair close and sat in it and held the bowl out to her. She looked at the bowl. Then she looked at him. Then she took the bowl with both hands, carefully, the way a person takes something they are afraid might disappear, and she drank from it. Not in small, careful sips. She drank the way someone drinks who has not had anything in a long time, in long pulls, and when she was done she turned the bowl up and got the last of it with her tongue and then held the bowl in her lap and looked at him again. Thomas broke the bread in half and gave her 1 piece. She ate it in 4 bites. He gave her the other piece. She ate that too. He watched her eat and did not say anything. When she was done, she pulled the blanket tighter around herself and leaned back in the chair, and her eyes started to close, then opened again, then closed again. "Go to sleep," Thomas said. "It's all right." Her eyes closed and did not open again. He sat there in the other chair for a while, watching her breathe, making sure the color was coming back to her face. It was. Slowly, the blue went out of her lips and they went back to the right color. The shaking slowed and then stopped. Her breathing evened out, long and slow. Thomas got up and went to the window. The snow was still coming down. He looked out at the dark and tried to think about where a child like that could have come from and what could have brought her to his porch on Christmas Eve without shoes or a coat or anyone with her. He did not figure it out that night. He just watched the snow fall and let her sleep. In the morning, she was still in the chair. Thomas woke up from where he had fallen asleep, sitting at the table with his arms folded under his head. And the first thing he did was look over to make sure she was still there and still breathing. She was. The color in her face was better. She had stopped shaking in the night and pulled the blanket all the way up to her chin, and she looked almost peaceful except for the hollowness of her cheeks and the cut above her eye. Thomas built the fire back up and put coffee on, and then got the last of his eggs from the cold box outside and cracked them into the pan. He had 4 eggs and some salt pork. He cooked all of it and put it on a plate and sat down across from her chair and waited. She woke up a little while after, slowly, the way children do, blinking and looking around without moving her head much. When she saw Thomas, she went still, and for a moment he thought she was going to be frightened, but she just looked at him steadily with those dark white eyes. "Morning," Thomas said. "There's food." He pushed the plate toward the edge of the table where she could reach it. She got out of the chair slowly, keeping the blanket around her shoulders, and came to the table and sat down and ate. She ate all of it. When she was done, she sat with her hands in her lap and looked at him. "What's your name?" Thomas asked. She did not answer right away. He waited. "Clara," she said finally. Her voice was very small and rough, like it had not been used in a while. "Clara," Thomas repeated. "I'm Thomas Hale. This is my place. Do you know where you are?" She shook her head. "About 6 miles outside of Caldwell," he said. "Kansas. Do you know anyone in Caldwell?" She shook her head again. "Where did you come from, Clara?" She looked at the table. Her hands tightened in her lap. "It's all right if you don't want to say," Thomas said. "You don't have to say anything you don't want to." They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the wind was still moving, but the snow had stopped. Thomas could hear it in the eaves, that particular sound of a winter morning after a storm. "There was a wagon," Clara said. She said it quietly, still looking at the table. "We were on a wagon. Mama and me and the man." "What man?" "The man Mama was with." She paused. "He wasn't my papa. My papa went away before." Thomas waited. "The wagon went wrong," Clara said. "In the dark. It went off the road into something and it went over. The man fell out and I think he got hurt bad. Mama got out and she picked me up and we walked. But then Mama..." She stopped. Her hands tightened harder. "Mama sat down in the snow and she said she needed to rest, and she told me to keep walking and find a house with a light, and she said she would come." Thomas felt something go cold in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. "When was this?" he asked, keeping his voice even. "Before dark," Clara said. "A long time before dark." Thomas stood up. "Clara, I need to go out and look for your mama. I want you to stay right here in this chair with that blanket and I'll be back." She looked up at him and he could see in her eyes that she knew, maybe had known since she sat down in the snow herself and then kept walking anyway, had maybe known from the moment she heard her mother say rest, what the snow and the cold did to people who sat down and did not get back up. "Stay here," Thomas said again. "I'll come back." He put on his coat and his hat and his boots and went out into the white morning. He found the wagon half a mile up the road, nose down in a gulch, one wheel still turning slowly in the wind. He found the man 50 yards from it, half buried already, his neck at an angle that told the whole story without any words needed. He found Margaret. Not Margaret, he reminded himself, Clara's mother. Another 100 yards further on, sitting against a fence post with her hands in her lap and her eyes closed, snow piled on her shoulders like a shawl someone had laid there gently. She was gone. had been gone for hours. Thomas stood there with his hat in his hand for a moment because it seemed like the right thing to do, and then he put his hat back on and went back to his house. Clara was where he had left her. She looked at his face when he came in and she read it the way children read things, directly and without softening. "She's not coming," Clara said. "No," Thomas said. "She's not." Clara looked at the table. She did not cry, not right then. She just sat very still with her hands in her lap and her face doing something complicated that Thomas did not know how to help with because he had never been very good at that kind of thing. He sat down across from her and did not try to say anything useful because he knew there was nothing useful to say. He just sat there, which was what he had to offer, and it seemed to be enough because after a while Clara looked up at him. "What happens to me now?" she asked. It was a practical question. Thomas could see that she was being practical on purpose, holding on to practical things because they were solid and the other things were not. He respected that. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But you don't have to worry about that today." That was Christmas Day, 1872. The town of Caldwell was not large, and it did not have what you would call an organized system for dealing with children who had no one. There was a sheriff named Ed Pruitt who was a decent man, and there was a woman named Hattie Oakes who ran the boarding house and took in strays of various kinds, and there was a preacher named Calloway who meant well and talked too much. When Thomas drove Clara into town 2 days after Christmas, bundled in his spare coat with her feet wrapped in strips of wool because he had no boots small enough for her, these were the people he talked to. Sheriff Pruitt listened to the whole thing with his thumbs hooked in his belt and then went out and confirmed what Thomas had found on the road. He wrote it down in his book. The man from the wagon turned out to be someone named Garrett Cole, a drifter who had come through Caldwell once before, not fondly remembered. Clara's mother was identified as a woman named Eliza Ward, originally from Missouri, no family that anyone knew of. Clara sat through all of this on a chair in the sheriff's office wrapped in Thomas's coat and did not say much. She answered questions when they were asked of her, quietly and precisely, and did not volunteer anything more than what was needed. Thomas watched her and thought she was either the most self-contained child he had ever seen or she was still in that place people go after something very bad happens, where everything feels like it is happening at a slight distance. Hattie Oak said she could take the girl in, she had a room, but she said it the way a person says something they feel they are supposed to say rather than something they actually want to do, and Thomas could hear the difference. Preacher Calloway started talking about a children's home in Wichita and Thomas stopped listening around the time the preacher started on his third sentence. "She can stay with me," Thomas said. Everyone in the room looked at him. "For now," Thomas said, "until something better gets figured out." Sheriff Pruitt looked at him for a long moment, measuring something. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "For now." Clara looked at Thomas from across the room. She didn't say anything, but she got up from the chair and came and stood next to him, which he figured was more or less the same thing. That was how it started. Not with a plan or a decision exactly, but with a child standing next to a man in a sheriff's office in Kansas on a cold morning after Christmas, and both of them having nowhere better to go than back to the same house. The first weeks were strange. Thomas was not accustomed to having anyone in the house and Clara was not accustomed to staying in one place for long. He could see that, the way she always knew where the door was, the way she slept curled very small in the corner of the bed, he had made up for her rather than spread out in the middle the way children usually sleep when they have room. She was watchful without being fearful, careful without being timid. She helped with things around the house without being asked, sweeping and stacking wood and carrying water, and she did it with a competence that told him she had been doing such things for a long time. He did not push her to talk. He talked when he had something to say and was quiet when he did not, which was most of the time, and she seemed to find that comfortable rather than troubling. They developed a rhythm, the way people who live in the same small space always do, learning each other's habits and adjusting around them. She started asking questions about the third week. Small ones at first. What was that bird? What were the horses' names? How did you know when the ground was too frozen to work? He answered everything she asked, briefly and straight, and she listened to his answers with her whole attention, which was something he noticed because not many people listen that way. Then one morning at breakfast she looked up from her plate and said, "Are you going to send me away?" Thomas put his coffee down. "Do you want to go?" She thought about it seriously, which he appreciated. "No," she said. Then I'm not sending you away. She nodded and went back to her breakfast. That seemed to settle something for her because after that she was less watchful about the door. By February she had started following him out to the barn in the mornings. He gave her small things to do, filling water troughs, bringing hay, and she did them without complaining even when it was cold enough that her breath came out in clouds. He got her proper boots from the dry goods store in town, and a coat that fit and a hat, and she wore them all with the gravity of someone who understood exactly what it meant to have warm things and did not take it lightly. One of the horses, a bay mare named Ruth, took to Clara immediately. Animals sometimes did that, made their own decisions about people, and Ruth had decided that Clara was someone worth paying attention to. She would put her big head down when Clara came in the barn, and Clara would stand on the lowest rail of the stall and put her hands on either side of Ruth's nose, and they would look at each other with a kind of mutual seriousness that Thomas found, privately, very funny. He taught her to brush Ruth properly, long even strokes, and how to check her feet for stones, and Clara learned everything he showed her in 1 or 2 tries and then did it exactly that way from then on, which was more than he could say for most grown men he had worked with. Spring came and the work got heavier. Thomas had 60 head of cattle and 30 acres that needed planting, and he did the work of 2 men alone because that was what there was to be done. Clara could not do much of the heavy work, but she took over everything she was able to, the cooking, the washing, keeping the kitchen garden, feeding the chickens, and she did it all with that same quiet competence, never complaining, never asking for praise. He started to notice, watching her, that she had opinions, strong ones, held without apology, which she expressed simply and without raising her voice, and then let go of if the decision went another way. He respected that. It was a rare quality even in adults. She started asking questions about the ranch. How much did a steer sell for? What did the bank take for the land note? How much did seed cost compared to what the crop would bring? She asked these things not the way a child asks things out of idle curiosity, but the way a person asks when they are trying to understand how something works, building up a picture piece by piece. Thomas answered her seriously, and she filed the answers away somewhere behind those dark, steady eyes. "We're not rich," she said one evening. It was not a question. "No," Thomas agreed, "but we're not in trouble. Not so far." She considered this. "That's good," she said. Then she went back to her mending. He thought about that exchange later, lying awake in the dark. She had said we without seeming to notice she had said it, the way people say things when something has become true enough that they stop thinking about it. He lay there listening to the quiet of the house, which was a different quiet than it had been in December, not the pressing kind but just the regular kind, the kind that meant everyone who was supposed to be there was there, and after a while he went to sleep. Summer was hot and dry, the way Kansas summers always were, and the cattle needed moving to where the grass was, and the grass needed watching, and the fences needed mending, and there was always more to do than there were hours. Thomas worked from before light to after dark most days, and Clara worked alongside him for as many hours as he would let her, which was fewer than she wanted. He made her rest in the heat of the afternoon, not because he thought she was fragile, but because he knew what heat exhaustion looked like and he did not want to learn it again. She taught herself to read that summer. He had a Bible and 2 other books, a history of something he had never gotten around to reading, and a collection of stories that Margaret had brought from Ohio, and Clara worked through all of them methodically, sounding out words she did not know and asking him when she got stuck, and then writing the new words on a piece of paper she kept folded in her pocket so she would not forget them. By September she was reading faster than he could and asking for more books, which he could not afford just then, but told her to put on the list of things to get when the cattle money came in. He took her to church sometimes when the weather permitted and the work allowed it. She sat in the pew next to him very straight and very still and listened to Preacher Calloway with an expression of polite skepticism that Thomas had to work to not find amusing. Afterwards several of the women in town would come and talk to her, and she was always correct and friendly and gave nothing away, which he recognized as the behavior of someone who had learned to be careful about what they offered to strangers. Hattie Oakes asked him once, in a low voice while Clara was looking at something in the dry goods window, whether he had thought about what he was doing, whether he had thought about how this was going to work long term, whether he knew what people were saying. Thomas said he had not thought much about what people were saying, and Hattie gave him a look that was half disapproving and half something else, something more like respect, and let it go. He knew what people were saying. Some of it was well-meaning. Some of it was the kind of talk that small towns do because small towns need to have opinions about the business of everyone in them. None of it changed anything because Clara was in his house and she was learning to read and she knew all the horses by name and she said we when she talked about the ranch. And Thomas had stopped thinking of this as temporary sometime around April without quite deciding to. Fall came and the cattle sale was good, better than Thomas had expected. He paid down the land note and bought supplies for winter and then he took Clara to the dry goods store and told her to pick out 6 books. She stood in front of the shelf for a long time, looking at each one with great seriousness, pulling them out and reading the first pages and putting some back and keeping others. She ended up with 5 books and a copybook and a bottle of ink and a pen, which she had substituted for the 6th book without asking him if that was all right, and then looked at him to see if he would say something. He didn't. He paid for it all. She read all 5 books by November and started over again. She also started writing in the copybook, small close writing that she kept private, which he respected absolutely. He never asked what she wrote and she never told him, and that was fine. The second winter was easier than the first. Thomas had gotten a second cow the previous spring and so they had milk and butter, and the root cellar was well stocked, and Clara had turned out to be a better cook than Thomas by a fair margin, which she had discovered by accident when he was down with a fever for a week in October and she had managed everything herself. He came back to himself on the 7th day to find the house clean, the animals tended, and a pot of something on the stove that smelled better than anything he had made in years. "You've been doing this for a while," he said, meaning the cooking, meaning more than the cooking. "Most of my life," she said, which told him something about what her life had been before the wagon and the snow. He didn't push, but he thought about it. He thought about a lot of things that second winter, the long evenings by the stove, Clara reading or writing or asking him things about ranching and farming and the way land worked and the way weather worked and the way money worked. She was 8 years old by then, or close to it. They were not entirely sure of her exact age, and she had a mind like a piece of good equipment, precise and durable and better than what you usually expected. He thought about what she would need that he might not be able to give her. He thought about schooling, real schooling, beyond what she was teaching herself from 5 books and whatever he knew, which was considerable when it came to land and animals and weather and not much else. He thought about how she would grow up and what she would need when she did. He thought, and this surprised him, about what she would think of the ranch when she was grown, whether she would love it or leave it, whether the land would take something from her the way it had taken things from Margaret, whether he was doing right by her or whether he was, without meaning to, doing to her what the land had done to him, making her into someone who could only exist in one particular place. He did not reach any conclusions. He just kept thinking, and meanwhile the winter went on, steady and cold and requiring everything it required, and Clara kept reading and writing and feeding the chickens and talking to Ruth in the mornings with her hands on either side of the horse's nose. The school came to Caldwell in the spring of 1874. Not a proper building yet, just a woman named Dorothea Brand who had come from Illinois with a certificate and a box of books and the intention of setting up classes wherever she could find space, which turned out to be the back room of the church. Sheriff Pruitt told Thomas about it, and Thomas drove Clara into town the following week to meet her. Dorothea Brand was a small, quick woman with a precise way of speaking that reminded Thomas of Clara herself. She talked to Clara for 20 minutes while Thomas waited outside, and when she came out she said that Clara was reading at the level of a 12-year-old and calculating at the level of a 10-year-old, and could she come 3 days a week. Clara could. That changed things. Not all at once, but over time, the way most things change. Clara came back from school with ideas and questions that Thomas could only sometimes answer, and the ideas and questions led to more ideas and questions, and she started talking more, not to him necessarily, just more, in the way people do when they are being given more to think about than they have had before. She made one friend at the school, a girl named Josephine Marsh whose family farmed about 3 miles north of Thomas's place. Josephine was a loud, generous girl with a big laugh that reminded Thomas of Margaret's laugh. Not the same, but from the same family of laughs, and she and Clara were an unlikely pair, the quiet, precise one and the loud, generous one, but they suited each other perfectly. Josephine started coming out to the ranch on Saturdays, which meant Clara had to be less watchful about behaving as if she might need to leave on short notice, because Josephine behaved as if she were already completely at home anywhere she happened to be, which had the effect of making everywhere feel like somewhere you could relax. Thomas found he did not mind having Josephine around. She filled the quiet in a way that was cheerful rather than demanding. The 2 girls were usually in the kitchen or out near the barn, and Thomas could hear them from wherever he was working, the high run of Josephine's talk and Clara's shorter, quieter answers. Sometimes they would go out to the far field and Thomas would see them from a distance, two small figures in the long grass, and he would stand and watch them for a moment the way you watch something that is good and that you do not want to look away from. He hired a hand that summer, a young man named Pete Aldous who was honest and strong and not particularly quick but reliable, which Thomas valued more than quick. Pete slept in the barn and ate breakfast and dinner with them and pretty much treated Clara the way you treat the daughter of your employer, which was exactly right since that was more or less what she was, even if no official arrangement had ever been made about it. Thomas had thought about that. He had thought about it more carefully after a conversation with Sheriff Pruitt in the spring of 1875, when Clara was 9. Pruitt had asked if Thomas had ever given any thought to making it formal, and Thomas said he had thought about it some. Pruitt said there was a judge who came through Wichita every few months if Thomas ever wanted to look into it. Thomas said he would think about it. He thought about it for a long time. The thing he kept coming back to was not whether he wanted to, because he had known the answer to that since approximately April of 1873 when Clara had said we and he had lain awake in the quiet house that was no longer pressing in on him. The thing he kept coming back to was whether it was the right thing for her, whether she should have a choice, whether there was something he should give her first before he asked. So in the summer of 1875 he sat down across from her at the table the way he had sat across from her in the early days, and he told her what he was thinking. He told her plainly and straight and without making it sentimental, which was not his way. He said that he had thought about her future and that he wanted to be sure she knew she had choices. He said he could take her to Wichita where there were better schools and more opportunities. He said there were people in town who had offered to help find a proper placement for her with a family that had more to give than he did. He said none of this was something he wanted, but that what he wanted was not the only thing that mattered here. Clara listened to all of this without moving. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want?" Thomas said he wanted her to stay. He said it was her choice and he meant that, but if she was asking what he wanted, that was what he wanted. Clara looked at the table. Then she looked up. "The ranch needs someone to run it when you're old," she said. This was the most practical thing she could have said, which was why she said it, because she was being practical on purpose the way she did when things got large and she needed something solid to hold. But her voice, when she said it, was not entirely practical. Thomas said she was right, the ranch did need someone. Clara said, "Then we should make it official." And that was how Thomas Hale came to be riding to Wichita in October of 1875 with Clara sitting beside him on the wagon seat. Both of them in their best clothes, which in Thomas's case meant his coat without any visible mends and in Clara's case meant the blue dress that Hattie Oakes had made for her that spring. Blue like the dress she had been wearing the night he found her on the porch, but this one warm and fitted and clearly not going anywhere. The judge was a man named Arbuckle who had done this before and did not make more ceremony of it than was necessary. He asked Clara the required questions, looking at her directly and waiting for her answers and taking them seriously, which Thomas appreciated. Clara answered everything calmly and clearly, and then Arbuckle signed what needed to be signed and Thomas signed, and then it was done. Clara Hale. It was official. They ate at the hotel dining room that evening, which was more money than Thomas usually spent on a meal, and Clara sat across from him and ate roast chicken with the fork held exactly right and kept her back straight and talked to him about the things she had noticed on the ride to Wichita, the changes in the land, the different color the grass was here compared to home, whether the farmers in this part of the territory were better off than the ones in Caldwell or just lucky with their soil. Thomas watched her talk and thought about the little girl on his porch in the snow, the one who had weighed nothing and drunk soup from a bowl with both hands. He thought about how far that seemed, not in time exactly because it had been less than 3 years, but in everything else. Then he thought about how far it did not seem, because she was still the same person, the same dark steady eyes, the same quality of attention, the same practical mind holding on to the same solid things while the rest of things sorted themselves out. He raised his coffee cup. "Clara Hale," he said. She looked at him. Something moved in her face, quick and real, and then settled. She raised her water glass. "Thomas Hale," she said. They drove home in the dark with a lantern hung off the wagon, the horses knowing the way well enough to need only the lightest guidance on the reins. Clara sat beside him, and after a while she fell asleep with her head against his arm, which she had not done before and which he did not move or comment on. Just let the horses find their way home through the dark Kansas night with the stars overhead and his daughter asleep beside him. That was October 1875. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good, which is a different thing. The land did what the land always does in Kansas, which is give sometimes and take sometimes and never quite let you rest. There were dry summers and there were winters that came in hard, and there was a year in 1878 when the cattle market dropped and Thomas had to renegotiate with the bank and Pete Aldous had to be let go for a season, which he took with good grace and came back from in the spring without being asked because he had nowhere better he would rather work. Clara was 12 by then, and she had outgrown Dorothea Brand's school in the back of the church, which Dorothea herself acknowledged with something between pride and regret. She had taught Clara everything she had to teach and then some. What Clara needed now was beyond what Caldwell had to offer, and Thomas knew it and Clara knew it. There was a school in Wichita, a proper one, with 2 teachers and a building made for the purpose. It cost money Thomas did not comfortably have. Clara found this out because Clara always found out the relevant facts of any situation, and she came to him with a proposal. She had been keeping the ranch accounts for 2 years by then, ever since she noticed that Thomas's bookkeeping was functional but inefficient, and she had reorganized them without being asked and presented him with a cleaner picture of where they stood than he had ever had before. Now she sat across from him with a piece of paper on which she had done calculations, and she walked him through them. If they sold the north pasture, which was less productive than the south pasture and cost proportionately more in fence maintenance, they would have enough to pay for 2 years of schooling in Wichita, and the remaining acreage would still support the herd if they reduced by 15 head, which at current prices they could do without going into difficulty. Thomas looked at the paper. He looked at her. "You worked all this out." "It took 3 evenings, she said, which meant she had been doing it without telling him while she was supposed to be reading. He looked at the paper again. The numbers were right. He had run them in his own head before, roughly, and she was right. "The north pasture is the best piece of land I own," he said. "It's the best-looking piece," Clara said. "It's not the best producing. I have the numbers here if you want to see them." She had the numbers. He looked at them. She was right again. He sold the north pasture in the spring of 1879, and Clara went to school in Wichita. She lived with a family named Tanner who rented out a room, steady people, the wife a friend of Hattie Oaks, and Thomas drove out to see her once a month, and she came home for summer and for Christmas. She wrote him letters in between, long letters full of what she was learning and what she was thinking about and questions about the ranch, and he wrote back shorter letters because he was not as comfortable with writing as she was, but letters that said what needed saying. She was good at school, which surprised no one who knew her. She was particularly good at the things that involved numbers and logic, which did not surprise Thomas, and she had a gift for writing, which surprised him a little because he had not known you could be taught to write well. He had assumed you either could or could not. Apparently you could be taught. She came home for good in the summer of 1881, 17 years old, with 2 years of schooling done and a third she could have done but chose not to because Thomas's knee had been giving him trouble and Pete Aldous had left to start his own place and the ranch needed both of them. Thomas had not asked her to come back. She had just come. He met her at the wagon stop in Caldwell, and she looked different in the way that people look different when you have not seen them every day, taller, more settled in herself, with the same dark steady eyes but something in them now that was less like watching for the door and more like knowing exactly where she was and having decided to be there. She looked at him for a moment when she got down from the wagon, and then she hugged him, which she had not done before, and he put one arm around her and patted her back the way he would have patted Ruth the horse, which was the best he could do in the way of that kind of thing, and she understood it perfectly. "How's the knee?" she said. "Fine," he said. "Is it fine, or is it something you're not telling me?" "It's manageable," he said. "That means it's not fine." She picked up her bag. "I'll have a look when we get home." That was how she came back. She looked at his knee when they got home and told him he needed to stay off it more than he was, which he did not do, and she started running the accounts full-time and managing the purchases and sales, which she did better than he had. She also took back over the chickens and the kitchen garden and the cooking, though she had gotten more adventurous about the cooking in Wichita and sometimes made things that were beyond what Thomas was prepared for at breakfast, which she thought was funny. She and Josephine Marsh, now Josephine Carlyle, her husband a good man who farmed north of town, picked up their friendship where they had left it, which was the sign of a real friendship, that it does not need constant maintenance to stay true. Josephine came out to the ranch on Saturdays sometimes still, just the two of them now without the running in the long grass, but the same essential thing, the loud generous one and the quiet precise one fitting together the same way they always had. Clara was 20 when she met Daniel Reeves. He was a surveyor working through the area for a land company. A practical, serious man who had grown up in Pennsylvania and come west for the work and intended to stay. He came to the ranch to discuss a boundary question Thomas had with the property to the east, and he stayed for dinner, and then he came back the following week for no particular reason, and then the week after that, and Thomas watched this happening with the quiet attention he applied to most things and did not interfere. Daniel was not a man who said much more than was needed, which Thomas considered a point in his favor. He was careful with his words and careful with his work, and he was clearly struck by Clara from the first moment, not in a loud way, but in the way of someone who has recognized something important and is trying not to be obvious about it. He was not very successful at not being obvious about it. Clara was more restrained, as Clara was always more restrained, but Thomas had watched her enough to know the difference between her being politely friendly and her being interested, and with Daniel she was interested. Daniel asked Thomas formally in the autumn of 1885 whether he could court Clara, which Thomas said was not really his question to answer, it was Clara's, and he said it without any edge in it but plainly, and Daniel took it well, said he understood, and then asked Clara, and Clara said yes. They were married in 1886, the spring of it, a small ceremony at the church with Preacher Calloway talking until Thomas was convinced he had lost track of time entirely. Josephine Carlyle stood up with Clara, and Josephine's husband stood up with Daniel, and Thomas sat in the front pew with his hat in his hands and watched his daughter get married. She was 22. She was tall and straight and had her dark, steady eyes and the expression she wore when she had made a decision and was fully at peace with it. Daniel stood next to her in his good suit, looking like a man who is aware he is luckier than he deserves to be and intends to be worthy of it. Thomas thought that was about the right attitude. After the ceremony there was food and some music and people talking, and Thomas stood at the edge of it the way he usually stood at the edges of social things, taking it in without being in the middle of it. Clara came and stood next to him at some point, still in her dress, her hand in Daniel's. "You all right?" she asked. "Fine," Thomas said. She looked at him. "Fine or manageable?" "Fine," he said. "Really?" She looked at him a moment longer and then leaned over and kissed his cheek, which he had not expected and which required him to look at something in the middle distance for a moment until he had his face under control. "Come to dinner Sunday," she said. She and Daniel had taken the Marsh house north of town, old Mr. Marsh having died the previous year and Josephine and her husband having built their own place. "I'm making that chicken thing you pretended not to like." "I didn't pretend. You ate 3 helpings." He went to dinner on Sunday. The years after that had their own rhythm. Daniel's surveying work kept him busy, but he came home every night and he was good to Clara in the ways that mattered, steady and present and honest, which was what she had needed more than anything else and had known to look for. Thomas had 2 grandchildren in the 4 years that followed, a boy named James and a girl named Margaret, and he found, to his own surprise, that he did not mind being around children the way he had spent most of his adult life minding being around children. James had Clara's eyes and Daniel's patience. Margaret had Josephine's laugh, which she must have absorbed somehow through proximity, and she followed Thomas around the barn from the time she could walk and wanted to learn everything about everything, which Thomas found he was well equipped to teach. The ranch was Clara's in all but name by then, had been for years. She managed it with the same clear efficiency she had brought to everything she had ever managed. And it was, for the first time in Thomas's tenure with it, genuinely prosperous. Not extravagantly, not the kind of prosperous that makes you careless, but the solid kind, the kind that means the note is paid and the animals are well and there is enough set aside for the dry years, which always came. Thomas was 61 in 1890 and his knee was worse than manageable, and some mornings he moved slowly and Clara did not say anything about it because she did not need to. He still worked. He would work until he could not, which was how he was built, and both of them knew it. But he worked less than he had and let Clara and Daniel and the 2 hands they now kept take more, and this felt less like giving up than like right order, the way things were supposed to go when you had built something that was meant to last past yourself. One evening in the fall of 1890 he was sitting on the porch in the last of the light, the air cool and smelling of the turned earth of the fields, and Clara came out and sat in the other chair, the one that used to be empty across the table from him, the one that had pressed against him with its emptiness in those early years. She had a cup of coffee and she gave him one, and they sat there looking at the yard. "James wants to work the ranch when he's grown," Clara said after a while. "He's 6, Thomas said. "He's been talking about it since he was 4. He's serious." Thomas thought about a 6-year-old boy being serious about something. He thought about a 7-year-old girl, or thereabouts, sitting in a chair with a blanket around her and asking what happens to me now with a practicality that had cost her something to hold on to. "He'll be good at it," Thomas said. Clara looked out at the yard. "He wants to raise horses too," she said. "Not just cattle. He likes Ruth." Ruth was very old now, older than horses usually got, held together by good care and, Thomas suspected, a stubborn personality. She was still in the barn. She was still Clara's in whatever way a horse can belong to a person who spends her mornings with her hands on either side of the horse's nose. "Ruth's not going to be here much longer," Thomas said. "I know," Clara said. "But there will be others. There would be others." That was the thing about a ranch, about land, about anything built to last. There would always be others. The work went on and the seasons went on and the generations went on, and what you put into it, if you put in the right things, came back in forms you had not expected. Thomas looked out at his land. Clara's land. James's land in time, if James held to what he wanted, which Thomas suspected he would because he had his mother's quality of deciding things and then staying decided. "That first night," Clara said. She said it carefully, not looking at him, looking at the yard. "Christmas Eve," Thomas said. "I didn't think you'd let me in," she said. "I thought you'd come to the door and look at me and close it again." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Why would I do that?" he said. "People do," she said. It was not said with bitterness, just the straight statement of someone who has paid attention to how the world works. When something is hard, when it will cost them, they close the door. Thomas thought about the door, the weight of it in his hand, the cold coming through from outside, the small gray figure on the other side of it. He thought about the moment before he bent down and picked her up, when the snow was coming in and the fire was behind him and the choice was there. He did not remember thinking about it. He did not remember it as a choice, exactly. It was more like the way you put out your hand when something is falling, not because you have decided to but because that is what hands do. "You were on my porch," he said. Clara looked at him now. Her coffee cup was in her hands and the evening light was in her eyes, and she was 30-something years old and had 2 children and a husband and a ranch that ran well and a life that was solid and real, and she had built most of it herself. She had all of that. And she was still the child on the porch, both at once, the way people carry all their ages inside them at the same time. "You gave me everything you had," she said. "You had almost nothing, and you gave me all of it." "The soup wasn't that good," Thomas said. She laughed. It was, he had always thought, a good laugh, not as loud as Josephine's and not like Margaret's. Completely her own, real and warm and unself-conscious. He had heard it for nearly 20 years, and it still struck him as the particular sound of something that had come through difficulty and arrived at something good. "Thomas," she said. "Clara," he said. They sat on the porch in the falling dark with their coffee cups and the land stretched out in front of them. The land that had been his and was now theirs and would be James's in time. The land that kept asking everything of you and sometimes gave back more than you had put in. The land that had taken so much from so many people and had given him, at the end, this evening. This daughter. This particular quality of quiet that was not pressing in from any direction but was just the good quiet of a house and a yard and a life that had people in it who were supposed to be there. The stars came out over the Kansas plain. The same stars that had been out that Christmas Eve in 1872 when the snow was falling and Thomas Hale had been sitting alone at his table with 1 bowl of soup and half a loaf of stiff bread and the silence pressing against him from every wall. He had opened the door. It had cost him his soup and his bread and his last chance, which had turned out to be not the last of anything but the first of what he had not known he was waiting for. The stars came out and the dark came on, and neither of them moved to go inside for a long time.